The Vicar's Missing Register. A Miss Marple mystery. The register had been bound in calfskin the colour of old tea, and Reverend Hargrove had always thought it the most beautiful thing in his care. Not the altar cloth, not the east window with its St. Francis and improbable deer, but this, the parish register of St. Mary Mead, begun 1782. In a clerk's hand so confident it still read clear as print, and continued through 2 centuries of births and deaths and marriages in inks that went from brown to black to blue, and back again, as fashions changed, and wars came and went. He kept it in the vestry cupboard, 3rd shelf behind the candlestick brass, and the spare surplices. He had not looked at it in 6 weeks, since old Mr. Flint had wanted to know his grandfather's baptism date, and they'd spent a pleasant half-hour with the 1901 pages, but the ink there a faded russet, the handwriting of Hargrove's predecessor cramped and listing to the right. Monday morning, 8:30. He unlocked the cupboard, his key, the only key, except for the one he'd given Major Grant 2 years ago, when Grant had taken on the churchwarden's duties and needed access during Hargrove's sabbatical, and found the 3rd shelf empty. He looked at the other shelves, which he did not know why he did, since a volume of that size could not be anywhere but where he'd put it, or somewhere else entirely. He checked behind the candlestick brass. He moved the surplices aside, both spare ones, the old linen and the new polyester that he still wasn't sure about. The register was gone. He stood for a moment in the vestry, which smelled of stone and old wood, and the faint paraffin of the heater that never quite reached the corners, and thought about what this meant. Miss Jane Marple had arrived on Saturday, which gave her 2 days before the trouble started, which was not enough time to do much, but which was, she found, enough time to notice the ink stain. She was staying with Dorothy Hargrove, the vicar's wife, to help with the arrangements for the autumn bazaar, the jumble sorting, the cake list, the small dispute between Mrs. Tanner and Mrs. Price Ridley about who had won the best preserve rosette in 1951, and therefore had seniority over the jam table. These were the sorts of difficulties Miss Marple was rather good at. She had a talent for making both parties feel they'd won, which was the only practical outcome, if she was given the guest bedroom at the back, with the window that looked over the garden, and past the hedge the church tower. October had stripped most of the leaves by now. The tower stood grey against a sky that couldn't make up its mind between cloud and blue. On Sunday, after morning service, she sat in the vicarage drawing-room while Dorothy went to see about lunch, and she noticed the blotting pad on the writing desk. The stain was roughly circular, an inch across, brownish with a reddish tinge. The colour of iron gall ink, the old kind, the kind they'd stopped using generally in the 40s. Not fountain pen blue, not the modern blue-black, something older. She didn't say anything to anyone about it. Monday was when the register disappeared, and by the time Reverend Hargrove had telephoned the police and the police had said they'd send someone tomorrow if nothing further happened, the noon train had already come in. Edmund Fairfax arrived with a Gladstone bag, a dark overcoat that had seen better decades, and an air of having rehearsed himself on the journey. He was perhaps 50, lean through the face, with the sort of careful grooming that suggests either fastidiousness or effort. His shoes were good. His cuffs were fraying. He came to the vicarage because it was the obvious place to come. The vicar's wife knew everything and was known to be kind. and strangers in St. Mary Mead invariably washed up at the vicarage before the day was out. Dorothy Hargrove gave him tea and listened, as she always did, and Miss Marple sat in the window seat with her knitting and listened too, and without appearing to. His story was this. His mother had been Eleanor Holloway, younger sister to the recently deceased Miss Prudence Holloway. Eleanor had eloped in 1943 with a man named Thomas Fairfax, a dispatch rider, over the fierce objection of the family. There had been a formal falling out. Miss Prudence had cut Eleanor off entirely, returned her letters unopened, the whole sorry business. Eleanor had died in 1961, Thomas Fairfax in 1978. Edmund Fairfax, their son, had spent the intervening years knowing nothing about his mother's family until a letter had arrived from a solicitor, a Mr. Wilkins of Corston, informing him of Miss Prudence Holloway's death and the terms of her will. The will, he said, left the estate to any living blood relative. He was, as far as he could determine, the only one. Yes, but there's the question of proof, Dorothy said, the marriage. He set down his cup. My parents were married in this church, in November of 1943. It'll be in the parish register. Ah, said Dorothy, and looked at her husband. Reverend Hargrove had the expression of a man who has had a very long morning and suspects the afternoon will be worse. Fairfax had brought letters, a bundle of them, tied with kitchen string, the envelopes brown with age. His mother's handwriting on the outside, various addresses, and one, he said, that had been written to his mother from Prudence herself, just before the elopement, which proved the family connection. Miss Marple looked at his hands while he spoke. They were steady, but he didn't fidget with the string or handle the letters with the nervous reverence that people use for things that are actually precious to them. He simply placed the bundle on the table as though it were evidence, which it was, and waited. You mentioned the rose arbour, Miss Marple said pleasantly. The one that used to be just inside the lich gate. Did you see it when you walked up from the station? He turned to her. He'd barely glanced at her since arriving. The natural oversight extended to elderly ladies knitting in corners. I'm sorry. You said when you came in that it was just as your mother had described it. The churchyard. A pause, very brief. The yew trees, I meant. Oh, of course. She counted stitches. The rose arbour was taken out in 1947, after the frosts killed it. Your mother would have known it. She left in 43. Dorothy looked between them. Hargrove looked at his hands. Fairfax said quite calmly, My mother described it in her letters, past tense, naturally. She knew it had gone. Yes, said Miss Marple, that would explain it. Mr. Wilkins arrived at 4 o'clock, which was earlier than anyone had expected him. And later than, Dorothy privately thought, he probably should have come. He was 60, pink-faced, with the compressed energy of a man who has been managing anxiety for so long it had become a kind of manner. He shook hands all around and refused tea, and sat on the edge of the sofa like a man expecting the upholstery to give way. He knew about the missing register. He'd heard from the police sergeant, who'd heard from the verger, who was Mrs. Quintana's cousin, and therefore connected to the entire village within approximately 90 minutes of anything happening. I want to be clear, he said, to no one in particular, looking at his briefcase, that the probate process has its own requirements and a parish register, while useful corroborating evidence is not the sole means of establishing. Who else has come forward? Fairfax asked. I'm not in a position— No one, then. Wilkins opened his briefcase and closed it again without taking anything out. Miss Marple had put down her knitting. She was watching Wilkins in the way she sometimes watched the rooks from her garden in St. Mary Mead, not with urgency, but with patience. Waiting for the thing that would happen next, which the rooks always knew before she did, and which Mr. Wilkins, she thought, was trying very hard not to let happen. "The bazaar is on Saturday," Dorothy said, filling the silence the way vicars' wives learn to do. "Miss Marple has been very helpful with the jumble." "That's very kind," Wilkins said. "Mrs. Kemp is bringing her chutney," Dorothy added. "She always does. Prudence Holloway's old housekeeper. She's been with the family 20 years, poor woman. She must be quite at a loss." Something moved across Wilkins's face. Gone before she could name it. "Yes," he said, "I should imagine she is." That evening, after supper, Miss Marple wrote a letter to her nephew Raymond. She told him the bazaar was coming along nicely, and that she had found a rather good first edition among the jumble donations, a trollop, which she thought he might like. She mentioned that she was staying with the Hargroves, and that there had been a small local upset. She did not mention the ink stain, or Edmund Fairfax and the rose arbour that no longer existed, or the way Mr. Wilkins had sat on the edge of the sofa with his briefcase on his knees, like a man guarding something he hadn't decided yet whether to surrender. There would be time for all that. She sealed the envelope and set it by her handbag for the morning post, and picked up her knitting again, and sat for a while in the window with the church tower dark against the October sky. The thing about village gossip is that it isn't gossip, not really. Gossip implies idle speculation. What St. Mary Mead ran on was closer to a filing system, distributed, cross-referenced, maintained with the rigour of something that actually mattered, because in a village it did. Miss Marple had known this all her life, and had never found reason to revise the view. By Tuesday morning she knew the outline of Miss Prudence Holloway's last weeks from 3 separate sources without having asked a single direct question. Dorothy Hargrove told her over breakfast that Miss Holloway had changed her will in September, 6 weeks before she died, which had struck people as sudden. The previous will had left everything to the Church Restoration Fund, a bequest made in 1962, and never revisited in the 40 years since. The new one, drawn up by Wilkins on a Thursday afternoon, left the estate to blood relatives, any living blood relatives, with the church as the fallback only if none could be found. Dorothy said this with the careful neutrality of a woman who recognizes that her husband's church stands to lose a considerable sum if Edmund Fairfax proves legitimate. The verger, Mr. Poole, told Miss Marple while she was crossing the churchyard that Miss Holloway had been asking questions about the parish records back in August. She'd come in herself, which was unusual. She hadn't been well enough for much walking that last year, and had wanted to look at the 1940s pages. He'd assumed it was the usual thing, family history. People got interested when they felt time pressing. She'd been in there an hour with the register, alone in the vestry, and when she left she'd seemed, he paused, searching for it, not upset exactly, settled, as though she'd confirmed something she'd already half known. And Mrs. Tanner's cook, whom Miss Marple encountered at the post office, mentioned entirely unprompted that the talk at the butcher's was all about the Holloway money, which was more than people had imagined. Apparently, the house alone being worth a sum that made the cook's eyes widen as she said it. So, Miss Holloway had looked at the register in August, had changed her will in September, had died in October. In between, Mrs. Dora Kemp, Miss Marple had not yet met Mrs. Kemp.
In a place like St. Mary Mead, gossip is more than just idle talk. It is a filing system. The talk at the butcher's was all about the Holloway money. I gathered the outline of her last weeks without asking a single direct question. The register was looked at in August, the will changed in September, and she was gone in October. Between the butcher, the baker, and the post office, nothing stays hidden for long. It's a comfort to know we're all looking out for one another, isn't it? Life is like a complex pattern in lace. If one thread is pulled, the whole shape begins to change. We just have to find which thread was pulled first. Miss Holloway wasn't well enough for much walking. When the body grows frail, the mind often becomes more determined to set things right before the end. But we must also consider those who hold the keys, like Major Grant.
She'd formed a picture from what she'd heard. The way you do, 60-odd, capable, 20 years in the same household. The kind of woman who knows where everything is, and whose rhythms have grown so fitted to another person's life that bereavement and unemployment come simultaneously and feel like the same thing. She came to the vicarage at 10:30 on Tuesday, carrying a pie dish that she returned to Dorothy with thanks and an apology for the lateness of its return, there having been so much to manage. Dorothy brought her into the sitting room and introduced Miss Marple as her old friend from St. Mary Mead, who was helping with the bazaar, which was true, and Mrs. Kemp sat down and accepted tea. She was not what Miss Marple had pictured. Smaller than expected. The capable ones often were. Her hair was set, and her dress was neat, and her hands, when she held the cup, were not quite still, not trembling, nothing so pronounced. But there was an effort in the stillness. It must be very hard, Dorothy was saying, after so many years. She was a difficult woman, Mrs. Kemp said, with the candour of the recently bereaved who have passed through the stage of speaking only well of the dead. I won't pretend otherwise. Particular about things, not unkind, but particular. The house must need a great deal of attention. Mr. Wilkins has asked me to stay on until probate's settled. She set down her cup. I said I would. Didn't seem right to just leave it. Quite, Dorothy said. Miss Marple counted stitches. She had noticed two things. The pie dish was a perfectly ordinary pretext. Mrs. Kemp could have sent it by any number of people, and had in fact held on to it for 3 weeks without difficulty. She had come today, on Tuesday, the day after Edmund Fairfax had arrived in the village. The timing was not coincidence, and Miss Marple didn't believe in coincidences of that particular tidiness. The second thing was that Mrs. Kemp had not mentioned Fairfax. He was the only news in St. Mary Mead, as every other person Miss Marple had spoken to in the past 24 hours had brought him up within 5 minutes. Mrs. Kemp sat and drank her tea and talked about the difficulties of managing an estate during probate, and did not say his name. People didn't avoid subjects by accident. Such a strange business, Miss Marple said mildly, still looking at her knitting. The parish register. Mrs. Kemp turned to her. Yes, the vicar must be very worried. Very. Of course, registers do go missing from time to time. Not often, but it happens. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Though usually when there's something in them, someone would rather not have found. A pause. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. I wouldn't know about that, Mrs. Kemp said. No, of course not. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. I was thinking of a business in the village where I live. A family matter. Quite different circumstances. Dorothy, who had learned over the years to ride out these conversational moments, refreshed the teapot. Mrs. Kemp left 20 minutes later. At the door, she paused and said, almost as an afterthought, "The night Miss Holloway passed, She'd asked me to bring up the old family papers, letters, photographs. She liked to look at them. She didn't look at Miss Marple while she said it. I put them away again afterwards. Seemed the right thing. Very thoughtful, Miss Marple said. Major Philip Grant lived in the stone house at the north end of the village, the one with the monkey puzzle tree that had been the wrong scale for the garden since 1923, and that everyone agreed was terrible, and no one had touched. He was 67, retired from the army in the mid-50s, after a career that had been, by all accounts, solid rather than distinguished, and he had taken on the church warden duties with the combination of efficiency and self-importance that characterized most of what he did. He had the only other key to the vestry cupboard. Miss Marple had not spoken to him yet. She'd seen him twice, once crossing the high street on Monday afternoon, head down, walking fast for a man with no particular destination, and once on Tuesday morning through the chemist's window, buying aspirin and what looked like antacid tablets, which might mean nothing or might mean a man whose stomach had been unsettled since Sunday. Dorothy described him over lunch as the sort of man who counted things. Hymn books, tiles on the path, entries in the collection ledger. He told Simon the guttering had 17 different rust patches last March. Counted them himself. He'd have noticed the register was there, Miss Marple said. He'd have known when he last saw it. Date and time, probably. Dorothy looked out at the garden. He's been odd since Sunday. Didn't stop to talk after the service, which isn't like him. He usually has something to say about the attendance. He lives alone. Since his wife died, 4 years ago, his daughter comes at Christmas. Miss Marple thought about the antacid tablets. Has he spoken to the police? The sergeant came round Monday afternoon. Philip said he'd been in the church Saturday evening, locking up, and the register was there then. He's quite sure. That narrows it to Saturday night or Sunday morning. The church is left open during the day on Sunday. Yes. Miss Marple folded her napkin. Anyone could have gone in. Edmund Fairfax spent Tuesday at the pub, the Red Lion, which was where visitors stayed when there was no other option, and which served a reasonable enough lunch that it didn't feel entirely like a penance. He was seen there by the landlord, by the landlord's wife, and by young Derek Poole, no relation to the verger, who told his mother who told half of St. Mary Mead by tea-time. He'd been asking about Miss Holloway. Not obviously. No one said he'd been asking exactly. But he'd got people talking, which was nearly the same thing. He knew she'd been ill for the past 2 years, that she hadn't left the house much, that she'd been a generous contributor to the church roof fund, and less generous to the village fete. He knew, by the end of the afternoon, that Mrs. Kemp had been considered a devoted housekeeper by most, and a managing sort by others, and that Mr. Wilkins had handled the Holloway family's legal affairs for 15 years, without any particular controversy anyone could recall. He didn't ask about the Rose Arbor. Miss Marple thought about that on Tuesday evening, sitting in the drawing-room while Hargrove worked on his sermon in the study. He'd volunteered the information about the Rose Arbor on his own, in his first 10 minutes in the vicarage. Either he genuinely believed his mother had mentioned it in the past tense in her letters, and saw no reason to raise it again, or he was careful enough to know when to leave a thing alone. Oh, both explanations were possible. One of them mattered more. She had spent the afternoon sorting jumble in the village hall. 4 boxes of clothing, 2 of books, 1 of miscellaneous kitchen items that someone had clearly cleared from a house in a hurry and hadn't examined very closely. Among the books she found a 1940s edition of Whitaker's Almanac, a guide to wireless sets, and a slim brown volume with no title on the spine that turned out, on opening, to be a household account book from the 1930s. She held it for a moment. The handwriting was the same careful copperplate that appeared in the later pages of the parish register. The same slightly rightward lean on the capital letters, the same way the ink thickened on the downstrokes. Not Miss Holloway's hand, and she'd seen a note from Miss Holloway when Dorothy had shown her a thank-you letter sent after last year's bazaar. And the writing was quite different. Smaller, compressed, the writing of someone who had been taught economy. She placed the account book in the pile for further inquiry. There was always a pile for further inquiry in Miss Marple's experience of jumble, and continued sorting. Outside, the afternoon had gone dark early, the way October afternoons do, and someone was walking slowly up the lane toward the church. She didn't see who, only the shape of a person in a dark coat, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has a reason to be there and a reason not to be seen. She almost called out. Then didn't. There would be time.
Major Grant is a man of military precision. He counts the tiles on the path. He had the only other key to the vestry cupboard. In our long lives, we learn that a key is a symbol of great trust. I saw him at the chemist buying antacids. When the mind is troubled, the stomach is often the first to tell the tale. We must listen to what our bodies are trying to say. He lives alone since his wife passed. Solitude can be a quiet companion, but it can also make a man's own thoughts sound much louder than they ought to be. The Major saw a light in the church Sunday night, a torch moving behind the glass. A light where there should only be shadows is always an invitation to trouble. Careful men often confuse caution with control. They think they can manage the risk themselves. Meanwhile, Mr. Fairfax has been at the Red Lion, getting people to talk. I found a household account book from the 1930s. Handwriting, my friends, is as unique as a fingerprint.
Miss Marple had tea with Edmund Fairfax on Wednesday afternoon at the Red Lion, in which she arranged by the simple method of asking Dorothy to mention to the landlord's wife that she'd like a word with their guest, and waiting for the message to travel the 300 yards between the vicarage and the pub, in the way that messages in St. Mary Mead always did, quickly, reliably, and with a small addition of context that nobody had authorized. The Red Lion's tea was not good. The milk came in a small metal jug that had clearly been cold before someone thought to warm it, and the biscuits were the plain ones, not the chocolate. Fairfax had been there long enough to know this, and had ordered without complaint, which told her something about his patience, or possibly his finances. He stood when she came in. Old habit. She liked that about him. "You're the lady who knew about the rose arbor," he said. "Aha, I'm the lady who didn't know about the rose arbor," she corrected pleasantly, settling into the chair across from him. "You're the one who knew about it. I was merely curious where you'd learned." He smiled. It made him look younger and more tired at the same time. "You think I invented the letters?" "I don't think anything yet. I find it's better not to." He turned his cup in its saucer. "My mother wrote about the churchyard several times for the yew trees, the lich gate, and an arbour that she said the frost had killed before she'd had a chance to see it properly, which had always struck her as typical of how things went." "Typical of how things went," Miss Marple repeated. "That's a particular way to remember it. She was a particular woman." He said it the same way that Kemp had said it about Prudence Holloway, with the flatness of truth. She'd had a hard time of it, eloping at 20, cut off from her family, 2 children in 3 years, and my father away more than he was home. She tended to notice the things that didn't come to anything, Miss Marple thought about the letters, tied with kitchen string. She thought about the way he'd set them on the table, like evidence, and not like something he'd carried a long time. "May I ask," she said, "whether your mother ever attempted to contact her sister?" A pause. He'd expected other questions first. "Once, in 1955. My father had died. The first time, I mean. He had a heart episode, and we thought... Anyway," she wrote. The letter came back unopened. "And after that?" "She didn't try again. But she kept the letters she'd written. The unsent ones, yes. She kept everything." He looked out the window at the high street. The October afternoon settling into early dark. "There are things I can't verify. I know that. I know how this looks. A stranger turning up from nowhere, with a bundle of old paper and a claim on a dead woman's money. I know what people will think." "What people think," Miss Marple said, "is usually approximately half right. The difficulty is knowing which half." He looked at her properly for the first time. Most people didn't look at her properly. They saw elderly, and their attention moved on. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," she said carefully, pouring her tea, "that you knew about the rose arbor from a source that knew it was gone, which is either a letter written after 1947 or someone who told you what to say." She set down the pot. "But the first explanation is simpler. And you strike me as a man who's had a difficult enough time without making things more complicated than they need to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The letter is dated 1951. She writes that even the arbor was gone by the time she thought about going back. I can show it to you." "I'd like that," Miss Marple said, "but not today." She walked back to the vicarage in the early dark, past the post office and Hartwell's draper with its window display of autumn woolens, past the bus shelter where two young women were talking with the focused intensity of people solving something important. And she thought about the Thursday before Miss Holloway died. The difficulty with reconstructing what had happened that evening was that there were 3 accounts and none of them agreed, which was usual in Miss Marple's experience, and didn't mean anyone was lying, necessarily. People remembered what they'd been paying attention to, and people paid attention to different things. What was agreed? Miss Holloway had been in bed for most of that week, a chest cold that had kept her largely upstairs. She was not considered seriously ill. The doctor, Dr. Purslow, had been on Tuesday and seen nothing alarming. Mrs. Kemp's account. She had brought Miss Holloway her supper at 6:30. And at some point during the evening, she said around 8, though she wasn't precise, Miss Holloway had rung the bell and asked for the family papers. The box of them, letters and photographs, and she'd mentioned the records, which Mrs. Kemp took to mean the family Bible and the old photographs, because that was what people usually meant, and she'd brought the box up, left Miss Holloway with it, come back at 9:30 to find her sleeping with the box on the coverlet beside her, and put it away on the landing shelf. The doctor's account. He'd stopped in unexpectedly on Friday morning, having heard she'd been poorly, and found her somewhat agitated. She'd said she'd had a tiring night, that she'd been looking through old papers, and it had stirred her up. She'd seemed physically well enough, but mentally restless, he'd said. Like someone who'd made a decision and wasn't sure of it yet. The third account came from Reverend Hargrove, who had it from the verger, who had it from his wife, who had been visiting a neighbour in the lane behind Holloway House that Thursday evening, and had seen a light in the upstairs window quite late. Gone midnight, which was unusual for a woman who'd been keeping to her bed. So, The box came up at 8. Mrs. Kemp returned at 9:30 to find Miss Holloway asleep, but a light still burning at midnight. Either Mrs. Kemp was wrong about the time she'd returned, or Miss Holloway had woken after being found asleep, or someone else had been in the house. The gap that interested Miss Marple most was the 40 minutes between Mrs. Kemp bringing the box up and claiming to have looked in. She said around 8, possibly 8:15. She said she'd checked on her at 9:30. In the general account of an evening, 40 minutes was nothing. In the account of a night that preceded a woman's death by 4 days, it was considerable. She had almost reached the vicarage when she heard the gate of the churchyard and turned. Major Grant was coming out of it. He was a broad man, grey, pale grey eyes in a reddish face, the colouring of someone who'd spent years outdoors in the wrong weather, and he walked with the slight forward lean of a man accustomed to moving against resistance. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marple." He'd been introduced to her on Sunday briefly. He had the manner of a man who filed names and faces accurately. "Late for the churchyard?" "I was walking back from the Red Lion," she said, "the long way." He glanced back at the church. The lights were off. "I was checking the side door. Someone left it unlocked yesterday afternoon." "That's careless." "It is." He looked at her. "Have they found the register?" "Not yet." He made a sound that was not quite a word. Dissatisfaction, or something heavier. "I've been going through it in my head. At the Saturday evening I locked up at 6. It was there then, 3rd shelf. I checked the cupboard because it's in my habit to check everything, which some people find excessive." He said this without apology, as a statement of fact about himself. "And now it's gone. And the police sergeant seems to think it'll turn up in someone's attic and—" He stopped. "You don't think that?" "I think it was taken with a purpose," Miss Marple said, "which means it's somewhere it could be found again, if someone knew where to look." He was quiet. A car went past on the high street, headlights sweeping briefly across the yew trees. "There was a light in the church Sunday night," he said abruptly. "I saw it from my bedroom window, the side window that faces the tower. A torch, I thought, moving behind the glass. I nearly came over." He paused. "I didn't. It was late, and I thought I'd imagined it." "What time? Past 11? Nearer midnight, perhaps?" 2 nights before his own assault, which hadn't happened yet, which Miss Marple was already worried about, though she didn't say so. "Major Grant," she said, "I wonder if you might do something for me. Nothing dramatic. Simply, for the next few days, don't go into the churchyard after dark." He looked at her with the expression men of his type sometimes had, the slight resistance of someone being told to be careful by a person he'd instinctively underestimated. "Is that advice?" he said, "or a warning?" "Both, I should think." She smiled. "There's a particular kind of person who steals a thing and then realizes someone else knows it's missing. The next worry for that sort of person is whether anyone saw them take it. You saw a light in the church. If you were to mention that where it could be overheard—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He was not a stupid man. She'd known that from the aspirin and the antacid tablets, which were the purchases of someone whose mind was troubling their body, not the other way round. "I'll be careful," he said, but he didn't avoid the churchyard. That was the thing about careful men. They confused caution with control, thought they could manage the risk themselves, and went toward the thing they'd been warned away from because turning away felt like defeat. She watched him walk up the lane toward his house, hands in his pockets, and she thought, Tomorrow night, at the latest. She was wrong by 24 hours. It was tonight. She heard it at 10:20. Not the blow itself. She was too far away for that in the vicarage guest bedroom, with the window cracked an inch against the stuffiness of the radiator. What she heard was after. A sound that wasn't quite a sound, more a disturbance in the quality of the night. The way a stone dropped in still water doesn't make much noise, but changes everything around it. She was at the window in time to see a figure moving fast along the far side of the churchyard wall. Dark coat, no torch. Gone into the lane before she could have said anything useful about height or shape. She dressed quickly. At her age, quickly meant something different than it once had, but she managed. She took her walking stick, not because she needed it for walking, but because it was solid and she wasn't foolish. The churchyard gate was unlocked, and the grass was wet, and the stone path slick, and she went carefully, sweeping her torch in the low way that showed ground obstacles, until she found him between the third and fourth row of headstones. Face down with his cheek against the wet grass, one arm crooked beneath him. She checked his pulse first. It was there, steady enough. She didn't move him. Then she went back to the vicarage and woke Hargrove, and told him to ring Dr. Purslow, and after that, the police, in that order. The doctor came in 11 minutes. The police, Inspector Slack from Much Benham, who had apparently been reachable at this hour, which surprised everyone, came in 40. By then Major Grant had been moved, was conscious, was lying on the parlour sofa at the vicarage wrapped in Dorothy's good blanket, and had the specific expression of a man who is very angry about something and is in too much pain to express it properly. He had been struck from behind. A single blow, the doctor said, something smooth and firm, not sharp, a stone, possibly. There were enough of them in the churchyard, and they found no weapon, which meant either it had been pocketed, difficult, given the size of the likely object, or dropped somewhere in the dark, or thrown into the long grass by the north wall where the light didn't reach. "What were you doing in the churchyard?" Inspector Slack asked. He had a way of asking questions that implied the answer was already a disappointment. "Walking," Grant said, "at 10:20. I sometimes walk at night. I don't sleep well." Slack wrote something. "Did you see who struck you?" "I didn't see anything. I heard a step behind me, and that's the last thing until I was looking up at Miss Marple's torch." He glanced at her from the sofa with the expression of a man who owed a debt he wasn't entirely pleased about. "I should have listened to you." "You did listen," Miss Marple said. "You simply made a different decision." Slack looked between them. "You knew he might be in danger." "I thought it was possible," she said, "that if the person who took the register believed Major Grant had seen them, they might want to discourage him from saying so. And you didn't think to mention this to the police." "I mentioned it to Major Grant." Slack's expression said several things that he didn't put into words. He was not, Miss Marple had gathered from Hargrove's description, a man who liked being the last to know something. He'd arrived already wearing the expression of someone who suspects a village mystery has been doing perfectly well without him, and intends to resent it. He interviewed Grant for another 20 minutes, and got nothing useful, because Grant had nothing useful to give. He interviewed Hargrove, who told him about the missing register and the discovery on Monday morning, which Slack had apparently already known from the sergeant's report, which he'd apparently not read with great attention. He looked briefly at Miss Marple, in the way that men of his type sometimes looked at elderly women in parlours, registering her presence the way you registered furniture, and said he might have further questions tomorrow. He left at midnight. Well, Dorothy said, to the room in general. Grant was still on the sofa. If Purslow had said he could walk home, but shouldn't be alone, and Grant had resisted this assessment, and then, discovering that his legs were less certain than he'd thought, had accepted the parlour sofa with bad grace. "The light in the church," he said. "Sunday night. I told you about it, Miss Marple. I should tell him. Tell him tomorrow," she said. "It will be more useful tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes, she noticed, were brown. She'd thought earlier they were grey, the pale light of the high street playing tricks. And he had the look of a man revising his opinion of something. "You think you know who it is," he said. "I think I know most of it. Or there are one or two things I need to see before I'm sure. The register, among other things." By Thursday morning, the village had changed the way villages do after something violent happens in them. Not obviously. There were no locked doors, no absence of people on the high street. The post office was open at the usual time, and Hartwell's had put a new display in the window, winter scarves and sensible gloves. But something had contracted slightly. Conversations in the street were shorter. People didn't linger the way they had. Mrs. Price Ridley stopped Miss Marple by the post box to say that she'd always said St. Mary Mead wasn't what it was, and that her sister in Bournemouth never had this kind of trouble, and that Major Grant was a foolish man for walking at night at his age, and could Miss Marple confirm that he was likely to recover because she'd heard 3 different versions, and they couldn't all be right. Miss Marple confirmed that he was recovering well, which satisfied Mrs. Price Ridley enough to move on. She went to the church. She told herself it was the flower arranging. There were the Thursday arrangements to do, the altar and the 2 side tables, and she'd said she'd help with the bazaar preparations, which included the window display of donated items. This was true. She did the flowers first, taking her time, because she genuinely found it settling and because she needed to think. The church was stone throughout. Stone floor, stone walls, the cold particular to old buildings that have never been fully warm, even in August. Her footsteps were the only sound. 3 of the windows had the good medieval glass, deep blue and red, and the October light came through them at a low angle and pooled on the floor in colours that had nothing to do with October. She did the altar flowers, then the side table by the door. Then she walked apparently aimlessly toward the back of the church, toward the organ. It was a Victorian instrument, large for the size of the building, installed in 1887 according to the brass plate on the side. It had been out of tune for some years, and was played on Sundays by Mrs. Bellamy with a slightly martyred expression. The case was oak, dark with age, the pipes of varying height behind the decorative front panel. The panel itself was fixed by 2 wing nuts that could be removed without tools. Miss Marple stood and looked at it for rather a long time. Then she removed the wing nuts, set the panel carefully against the nearest pew, and looked into the cavity behind the front pipes, where the space was wide enough for a person to reach an arm in, and where the shadows were dense and the stone floor was thick with decades of undisturbed dust. Except for one clear space, approximately 14 inches by 10, where something had rested recently and been moved. She looked at the rectangle in the dust. She replaced the panel, refastened the wing nuts, picked up her flower basket and walked back through the church the way she'd come.
I told the Major not to go into the churchyard after dark. Sometimes advice is just a polite word for a warning. By Thursday morning, the village had contracted. Conversations were shorter, and people didn't linger. I went to the church for the flower arranging, but I found something else. Behind the organ pipes, a clear space in the dust where the register had recently rested. Arranging flowers is very settling for the mind. It gives one the space to arrange the facts of a case just as carefully. Every stem has its proper place. The dust has been disturbed, and the truth is ready to be told. Join me next time as we lay everything on the table.
She didn't take the register. She wasn't ready for that yet. Mrs. Kemp was in her garden when Miss Marple passed Holloway House on the way back to the vicarage. This required a small detour, a fact that could not have been lost on either of them. The garden was well kept, late roses still managing a few blooms against the south wall, the beds already put to sleep for winter with a thoroughness that suggested Mrs. Kemp had needed something to do with herself this week. They spoke across the gate for a few minutes. About the garden, about the difficulty of keeping roses through an early frost, about whether the bizarre weather would hold. Then Miss Marple said quite conversationally, "I imagine Miss Holloway's papers will take a great deal of sorting. All those family records. There's not so much as you'd think." Mrs. Kemp was deadheading a late rose as she spoke, her fingers quick and automatic. She was tidy about that sort of thing. Kept what mattered, burned the rest. The marriage lines and certificates, those she kept, I expect. That sort of document. I couldn't say what she kept. Snip, another deadhead into the truck. I didn't go through her papers. No, of course not. Miss Marple paused. It's only that the 1943 entry, the marriage entry, I mean, will be so important to Mr. Fairfax's claim. If it's in the register, which presumably it is or isn't, she let the sentence drift unfinished. Mrs. Kemp's hands had stopped, just for a moment. The snips poised over a stem, not cutting, then cutting. I wouldn't know what's in the register, she said. I don't have anything to do with the church records. No, Miss Marple said. Naturally not. She said goodbye and walked on, and she did not look back, because looking back was the kind of thing that made people careful, and she wanted Mrs. Kemp to believe she'd noticed nothing in particular, but she had noticed the hands. She'd noticed them on Tuesday too, that effort at stillness, the way they held the cup. But today was different. On Tuesday the hands had trembled with the general anxiety of someone managing a difficult situation. Today there had been one moment, a single held moment over a dead rose, that was something else. Not anxiety, fear, the particular fear of someone who has just understood that the path they thought was clear has a person standing in it. The inquest was Friday morning, 10 o'clock in the village hall. It was not a full inquest. The coroner, a thin man named Fellows, who drove over from Corston and had the manner of someone perpetually behind schedule, made clear from the outset that this was a preliminary hearing, that Miss Holloway's death had been recorded as cardiac failure, that he was present simply to confirm the cause before probate could proceed. He said this in the tone of a man who had said the same thing many times, and finds the words sufficient. The hall held perhaps 30 people, which was most of the village. They arranged themselves with the unconscious social geometry of people who have known each other a long time. The Hartwell family on the left as always, Mrs. Price Ridley in the third row where she could see everyone, the younger contingent at the back near the door. Edmund Fairfax sat alone near the front, his bundle of letters on the chair beside him, which struck Miss Marple as either confidence or theatre. Possibly both. Mr. Wilkins sat 2 rows back from Fairfax. He had a briefcase again. He always seemed to have the briefcase. Mrs. Kemp did not come. This was noticed. The fellows took the doctor's evidence first. Dr. Purslow was 62, unhurried, with the evidence of a man who has thought carefully about what he can and cannot say. He'd attended Miss Holloway on the Tuesday before her death, found her well enough given her age and the chest cold, prescribed rest and warmth. He'd been called on the Saturday morning when Mrs. Kemp had found her. Death, in his opinion, consistent with cardiac failure in a woman of 78 with a history of heart irregularities. He'd signed the certificate accordingly. Any reason to doubt that conclusion? Fellows asked. Purslow paused in a way that was perhaps half a second longer than straightforward agreement would have required. Nothing definitive. She had seemed agitated on my Friday visit, but that's not unusual at the end of a long illness. Agitated how? Preoccupied. She said she'd been looking at old papers and found something unsettling. I assumed it was a family matter and didn't press her. The hall was quiet in the particular way of people trying not to make the noise of paying attention. Fellows moved on to the register. Hargrove gave his account of Monday morning, the empty shelf, the undamaged lock, Major Grant, still somewhat grey from Wednesday night, and sitting stiffly in a way that suggested his head was troubling him more than he admitted, confirmed that the register had been present when he'd locked up Saturday evening at 6. Inspector Slack said the police were pursuing several lines of inquiry, which everyone understood to mean nothing useful had happened, and then Fellows asked if anyone else wished to speak to the matter. There was the small shuffling silence of public gatherings when that question is asked, when everyone assumes nobody will, and then Miss Marple stood up. She did it without drama. She simply rose from her chair in the 4th row, and Fellows looked at her with the expression of a man who has learned that elderly women at inquests are not always what they appear, and said yes. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, "whether the court might find it useful to consider the possibility that Miss Holloway's death was not from natural causes." The silence this time was different, compressed. "That's a considerable suggestion," Fellows said. "Yes, I'm sorry for it." She said this quite sincerely. "I've been thinking about a case in my own village many years ago, and the postmistress there had a brother who'd been falsifying entries in the post office accounts. When the inspector came to audit, she didn't destroy the ledger. She simply removed the relevant page and replaced it later, once she'd altered it. The inspector found nothing, because there was nothing obviously missing. Everything appeared to be in order." She paused. "The register from this church was not stolen to prevent a legitimate heir from proving his claim. It was taken to allow time to alter what it contained, or to remove what it contained, or perhaps most simply, to add something that isn't there." Fellows had put down his pen. "You're suggesting forgery. I'm suggesting that the register was taken by someone who needed to change what it said before it could be examined, and that this same person had reason to ensure Miss Holloway died before she could tell anyone what she'd found in those pages herself." "And who," Fellows said carefully, "is this person?" "Someone who knew the church well enough to hide the register where it wouldn't be found by accident. Someone with access to Holloway House. Someone who understood what was at stake in the new will, and understood it before most people did." She sat down. "I think that's enough for now." The hall erupted in the controlled way of British public gatherings, not shouting, nothing so undignified, but an immediate collapse of the silence into many small urgent conversations. High Fellows adjourned the hearing for 1 week. Fairfax caught her on the steps outside. "You know where the register is," he said, "not a question." "I know where it was," she said. "I believe it's been moved since yesterday. The person who took it will have realized by now that hiding it in the church was too obvious. The organ case is the sort of place that sounds clever until someone actually starts thinking about it." She looked up at him. "Someone who knows churches well, who knows this church." He was quiet for a moment. The October light was thin and sharp. Behind them she could hear people coming out of the hall, conversations tightening around the thing she'd said. "My uncle served as churchwarden here," he said. "My mother's uncle, I mean. Her father's brother before the war." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I know." He looked at her. How much of this did you know on Wednesday when we had tea?" "Most of the shape of it. Not all the detail." She found her gloves in her coat pocket. "There's something I'd like to ask you. Did your mother ever speak about the night she and your father married? Whether anyone from the family knew beforehand? Whether there was anyone at the ceremony?" He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. People who thought before answering were either honest or very skilled at appearing so, and she'd spent a long time learning to tell the difference. She said there was a woman who witnessed it. Not the churchwarden, someone else. She never said who. Just that there'd been a woman who'd been kind to her, who'd known the family and had promised not to say anything and had kept that promise. He paused. She said it with some feeling. It's the kept promise, as though it surprised her. Miss Marple put her gloves on, one finger at a time. "Yes," she said, "I imagine it would have." She went back to the vicarage and sat in the window seat with her knitting and did not knit. She was thinking about Dora Kemp, who was 30 years old in 1943, which meant she had been in service since her mid-teens and had been working in the Holloway household since 1941. Who would have been there when Eleanor Holloway crept out to marry her dispatch rider? Who would have been for a young woman in that position the nearest thing to a confidant the house contained? Who had witnessed the marriage? And who had, 30 years later, poisoned the woman she'd protected? The logic of it was not complicated once you had the facts arranged. Miss Holloway had been ill and had known it, and being ill and knowing it. She had looked at the register in August and found what she'd half known was there. The 1943 marriage, witnessed by D. Kemp, which proved Eleanor's son was the rightful heir. She had changed her will accordingly in September, and she had, in the last week of her life, looked through the family papers again. Not for comfort, for confirmation. What she'd found in those papers, or what she'd said to Mrs. Kemp when Mrs. Kemp came to collect them, was the thing that had killed her. Miss Marple had a reasonable idea of what it was, not certain. Reasonable. She picked up her knitting after all. The difficulty was that she had no proof of the poison. Purslow had signed the death certificate. The body was buried, and to exhume required authority, and authority required evidence, and evidence required something more than the word of an elderly woman in a window seat who thought things didn't add up. What she had was this. The register, wherever it now was, contained the 1943 marriage entry. If that entry had been altered, if someone had attempted to remove or falsify it, the alteration would be visible to any competent examiner. The handwriting of Hargrove's predecessor was distinctive enough. A forged insertion would be obvious. And if Mrs. Kemp had taken the register and replaced or altered that page, she would have done it already. which meant either the register had been successfully altered and replaced, possible, but it hadn't reappeared, or Mrs. Kemp still had it, which was a considerable risk she wouldn't carry longer than necessary, or she'd destroyed it. Miss Marple put down her knitting again. If she'd destroyed it, then Fairfax lost his proof, and Mrs. Kemp lost her reason to keep quiet, and Miss Holloway's death remained cardiac failure, and the estate went to the church, and everything closed over like water. Unless. She thought about the letter Fairfax hadn't mentioned at tea. The one he'd said, very casually, that his mother had written after the elopement to various addresses. She thought about Somerset House, which held copies of things that parishes sometimes lost or damaged or, in certain extreme cases, had removed from their custody by persons unknown. She thought, he has a copy. He must have a copy. A man that careful, with that much at stake, who'd come this far. She thought, he said Somerset House when I didn't ask him. He'd said it to Wilkins on Monday, according to Dorothy, who'd heard it from the verger's wife. He'd said it twice, which was once more than you needed to say something you expected no one to remember. He was letting it be known, not for her benefit, for Mrs. Kemp's. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, and thought about what it meant for a guilty person to learn that the thing they'd destroyed still existed somewhere else. That the burning of the evidence had changed nothing. That the effort and the risk had been for nothing. What that kind of person did next was one of two things. She stood up and went to find Hargrove. She asked Hargrove to invite them all for 7 o'clock. He looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression he'd been wearing since Monday. The expression of a man who has understood that something is happening in his house and his parish that he hasn't been told fully, and who has decided, on the basis of long experience with difficult things, to trust the person managing it. All of them, he said, meaning Mr. Fairfax, Mr. Wilkins, Major Grant, if he's well enough, and I think he will say he is, and Mrs. Kemp. Mrs. Kemp won't come. She'll come, Miss Marple said, if the invitation mentions that Mr. Fairfax has produced his copy of the marriage certificate from Somerset House, and that you expect the matter to be resolved this evening. Hargrove took his glasses off, put them back on. Is that true? The second part will be true by this evening. As for the certificate, Mr. Fairfax has been very careful about what he confirms and what he leaves people to assume. I think we should extend him the same courtesy. There was a long pause. Right, Hargrove said, and reached for the telephone.
We all gathered in the village hall. There is a certain geometry to how people sit when they have known each other for 40 years. Everyone knows where they belong. I stood up and suggested that Miss Holloway's death might not have been natural. A considerable suggestion, yes. The register wasn't stolen to prevent a claim, but to allow time to alter it. Careful work can often deceive a casual eye, but it cannot change the past. Mr. Fairfax's uncle was the church warden here before the war. Families are like rivers. They may wander far, but they always carry the silt of where they began. Mr. Fairfax had a certified copy of the marriage certificate from Somerset House all along. A sensible man always has a backup when dealing with a village full of secrets. Imagine the terror of a guilty person learning that the evidence they destroyed still exists elsewhere. The mind becomes its own prison when the truth starts to surface. I asked the vicar to invite them all for 7 o'clock. Sandwiches, tea, and the warm glow of a lamp. Old and buried things have a way of surfacing when estate lawyers start going through boxes. You cannot bury the past deep enough to keep it from coming back. The register was found under a floorboard, and now the time has come for the one who put it there to speak.
Dorothy made sandwiches, which was what Dorothy did when she didn't know what else to do. And the drawing-room was warm and lamp-lit, and looked, Miss Marple thought, almost unsuitably comfortable for what was about to happen in it. They arrived in order of anxiety. Wilkins first, at 10 to 7, briefcase present. The compressed energy of him wound tighter than she'd seen it. He'd heard about the inquest clearly, and had spent the day running calculations in his head that hadn't come out the way he wanted. He sat in the armchair nearest the door. Grant came at 5:02, moving carefully, with one hand occasionally drifting toward the back of his head, and then stopping. He'd changed his collar and brushed his jacket. The brown eyes steady, watchful. Fairfax at 7 exactly, which told her something about him. Not early, not late, the punctuality of someone who didn't want to appear eager, and had measured it precisely. He nodded to Wilkins, who nodded back with the wariness of men in adjacent positions in the same situation. Mrs. Kemp at 5 past. She had dressed carefully, her coat the good one, her hair done. She looked at no one directly when she came in. She took the chair nearest the window and sat with her handbag on her lap and her hands resting on it. And she looked at the carpet and waited. Dorothy poured tea. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "I want to begin," Miss Marple said. "Do with the register." The room attended. "It was hidden in the organ case. I found it yesterday morning." She said this simply, without the pause that would have made it dramatic. "I left it there because I wasn't certain yet how much had been done to it, and I wanted to think. I went back this afternoon and it was gone, which I'd expected." She looked at her knitting. "The person who took it has had it since Saturday night. Has had time to make whatever alterations were needed. I expect it will be found somewhere convincing. Perhaps discovered by a helpful parishioner in the next day or two. Perhaps posted anonymously to the vicar." Hargrove made a sound. "When it is found," she continued, "I think we'll find the 1943 entry has been altered, the witnesses' names changed, or the entry itself made to appear invalid in some technical respect. It's careful work, and it may even be convincing to a casual eye." She set down her knitting. "It won't matter." She looked at Fairfax. "You have the Somerset House copy." It wasn't quite a question. He met her eyes. "I do. A certified copy of the marriage certificate, obtained before you came here." She turned to the room. "He's been letting it be known, quietly, for 3 days, in case anything happened to the register. A sensible precaution taken by a man who knew his claim was legitimate, and who understood that legitimate claims sometimes need protecting." Wilkins had his briefcase open on his knees. He shut it. "So the register," Miss Marple said, "whatever has been done to it, proves nothing that the Somerset House copy doesn't already prove. Mr. Fairfax is Miss Holloway's nephew. Eleanor Holloway and Thomas Fairfax were married in this church on the 14th of November, 1943. She paused. "Witnessed by the church warden and by a young woman then employed in the Holloway household, whose name appears in that entry and will appear in the Somerset House copy. Dora Kemp." The room was very still. Mrs. Kemp did not move. Her hands on the handbag did not move. She had the stillness of someone who has been running a long way and has finally stopped. "You witnessed the marriage," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "You were the one who was kind to Eleanor, who kept the secret as you'd promised. For 30 years you kept it. Whatever you thought of Eleanor's choice, whatever difficulties it made for you in that household, you kept your word." She looked at her directly. "That matters. I want to say that plainly before I say the rest." Mrs. Kemp looked at the carpet. "Miss Holloway found the entry in August. She'd suspected for some time, I think. Mr. Fairfax's inquiries had begun reaching her through the usual channels, the solicitor's letters, and she knew her own sister had married, had a child. The new will was her way of correcting something she'd let stand too long. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, the same tone she'd have used discussing the jam table. She called for the family papers that Thursday evening not for comfort. She wanted to find the letters Eleanor had written to her in the early years of the marriage. The letters she'd returned unopened. She'd kept them all this time. Returned but kept, and she told Mrs. Kemp what she intended to do. Grant shifted in his chair. She intended to write to Mr. Fairfax herself, to acknowledge him, to ask Wilkins to expedite the probate and save the boy the difficulty of proving what she already knew was true. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She told Mrs. Kemp this, and Mrs. Kemp understood what it meant. The fire in the grate had burned down to a low, steady glow. The lamp on the side table made warm circles on the ceiling. There was something else in those family papers. A letter, I believe, that Miss Holloway had kept and not told anyone about. Something that recorded what Mrs. Kemp had done in another matter, a long time ago. Someone who died whose death was not quite as it had appeared. She paused. I don't know the full detail of it. I suspect Mrs. Kemp does. Wilkins had gone very still. Miss Holloway had known for some years, Miss Marple continued. She'd kept the knowledge the way people sometimes keep such things. Not as a weapon, simply as a weight she'd grown accustomed to carrying. She hadn't used it. Perhaps she'd decided it was too old to matter. Perhaps she'd simply found that knowing and acting on knowledge were two quite different things. She looked at the carpet for a moment herself. But when she told Mrs. Kemp about the letter to Mr. Fairfax, about the strangers who would come, the legal proceedings, the official attention, Mrs. Kemp understood that old and buried things have a way of surfacing when estate lawyers start going through boxes. The room breathed. The digitalis, Miss Marple said, is in the garden, the foxgloves. She'd tended them for 20 years. Mrs. Kemp spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and even. She wasn't going to suffer, she said. She was going to die anyway. Her heart, the doctor had told me in the spring quietly that it was a matter of time. She knew it herself. Yes, Miss Marple said. I'd looked after her for 20 years. Still the same low, even voice, as though she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. I'd looked after everything. The house, the accounts, everything she couldn't manage any more. And then to be turned out, not turned out, she'd have left me something, I know that. But strangers, lawyers, people asking questions. About the other matter. About everything. Her hands moved on the handbag. There was an accident years ago. A man who drank and drove and had done it a dozen times and would have done it again. It wasn't. I didn't plan it. But afterwards, Miss Holloway found a letter I'd written that I thought I'd burned. She never said anything, but she kept it. The room was quiet for a long moment. The register, Miss Marple said gently. Where is it now? A pause that lasted several seconds. My bedroom, under the floorboard beneath the wardrobe. She said it without expression. I hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Inspector Slack arrived at 8:15, having been telephoned by Hargrove at 7:45, and was in the position of a man walking into the last 10 minutes of something he'd been meant to be present for from the beginning. He managed this with moderate dignity. He had the presence of mind to ask the right questions in the right order, which Miss Marple found she could respect even while knowing he'd have reached none of this himself, but Eddie Kemp was taken at 9 o'clock. She went without resistance, which Miss Marple had expected. She'd had the manner since speaking of someone setting something down that had become too heavy. She paused at the door and looked back into the room, not at anyone in particular, and then went out into the October night. After, Wilkins stayed long enough to confirm with a transparency that Miss Marple found almost sympathetic that there was nothing irregular about the will, that he'd had no involvement in anything beyond the straightforward legal work, that he was glad the matter was resolved. The anxiety that had been coiled in him all week unwound visibly as he spoke. He left at 9:30. Grant sat for another half hour with a whisky that Hargrove had pressed on him, and said very little, and when he left, he pressed Miss Marple's hand briefly at the door. No speech, just the pressure of a hand. She found that sufficient. Fairfax was last. He stood in the hallway with his coat on and his Gladstone bag at his feet, and he looked like a man who had won something and was still working out how it felt. "She never knew about me," he said, "and my aunt. Did she?" She suspected. At the end, she knew. Miss Marple looked up at him. "She kept the letters, Mr. Fairfax. The ones your mother wrote to her that she returned unopened. She kept every one of them. I think that tells you something." He looked at the floor. His jaw moved. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose it does." He picked up his bag and said good night and went out. Dorothy was washing up. Hargrove was in his study, doing whatever vicars did after evenings like this one, praying, possibly, or simply sitting. The house had the settled quality of a place where something has been resolved. Miss Marple sat in the window seat. The church tower was dark against a sky that had cleared since yesterday. The stars visible for the first time all week. The yew trees stood the way they always stood, indifferent to the particular troubles of the particular year. She picked up her knitting. The pattern was a straightforward one, nothing complicated, a scarf in grey wool that she'd been meaning to finish since September. She'd dropped 2 stitches in Hargrove's study on Monday evening and hadn't noticed until Tuesday, and she'd carried the error along for 3 days before finding a moment to correct it. That was the thing about patterns. The mistake didn't disappear on its own. You had to go back to the row where it happened and work forward again from there. She knitted quietly for a while in the lamplight, and outside the church tower held the dark, and St. Mary Mead settled around her into its ordinary, unsuspecting sleep. The end.